Okay. So, all right, let me get my Bible open and we'll go ahead and get started. I'm doing this teaching because over the past several weeks, if not months, I've had several people come and talk about situations, where, is this gossip? Is this slander? Is this person gossiping? Am I gossiping? That kind of thing. And so I thought, with so many people talking to me about this idea, it makes sense to kind of just do a study to basically not ask, is so-and-so gossiping? Is so-and-so slandering? But I'm kind of getting into, how do I know if I'm gossiping? How do I know if I'm slandering? Because we all have situations where, like if I say or do something that is offensive to someone or causes harm or is even just misunderstood, like, are you able to talk about me without me being there? Like, people don't like to talk about people behind their backs, basically. We have it in our society. You just don't want to do that. But there are times and places where you have to, because you have to navigate through situations. And the person involved is not always going to be there. So I wanted to put this study together to kind of go through what it looks like as we kind of suss that out. And, I forget when it was, we talked about the importance of discernment and the idea that when you are going to discern, you're basically deciding between two or more things. Which one is the most accurate, which one is the most truthful. And you can't just rely on words to do that. Like if I say, it's sunny outside. Okay, you could take my word for it and say, okay, it's sunny outside. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Or you could go outside and see and confirm my words. That would be more of like discernment. You gather the information and you make a conclusion. So we're going to talk about slander first. And I'm just going to go through and I'm going to read. Normally I get into like the definition of what the word means, and then I go through its usage. I'm going to flip that around, and this might seem confusing for a little bit, but it's going to clarify as we go. So if you're scratching your head and wondering, why are we reading these scriptures? There's a reason for it. So we're going to start on, let's see here. Okay, we're going to start on... Yeah, and this is all of these verses we're going to read are going to use, they all have the same Hebrew word. So let's go to Psalm 15. Let's start there first. Psalm 15. I'm just going to read the whole psalm because it's short. Okay. O Yahweh, who may abide in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy hill? He who walks with integrity and works righteousness and speaks truth in his heart. He does not slander with his tongue. There is slander there, but we'll get to that in a second. Nor does evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend. In whose eyes a reprobate is despised, but who honors those who fear Yahweh. He swears to his own hurt and does not change. He does not put his money at interest, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things will never be shaken. So we have this he's talking about, who can live with Yahweh, who can dwell with Yahweh. And he goes through this kind of short list of what this person does and what they don't do. And he does not slander with his tongue. So this is a case where if you look for the word slander, like in your English and like say your Blue Letter Bible, it will take you here, okay? So the next several that we're going to read don't necessarily have the word slander in English. But I wanted to kind of bring these verses out because there's a meaning to the Hebrew word that kind of doesn't convey in English. Let's go to Leviticus 19. Actually, I think my study might have messed up here. This is... Okay, well, this will be a slight change of plans because when I saved this, apparently something chopped out some scriptures that I had listed. They are gone. Okay, well, I didn't catch that sooner. Okay, so Psalm 15 that we just read, there are, and after what I just said, you'll have to take my word for it, or you can look it up. The word that we just, man, I don't know what happened. That's frustrating. Yeah, I had 21 verses lined up here. I had 21 verses where the Hebrew word does not say slander. And I was going to read through them all first, and they are gone. I don't know why they didn't say. Everything else is there. I don't understand why that happened. Anyway, so we'll just get right to the point then. So slander, that's Strong's H7270. It's the Hebrew word regal. And the King James translates it a few different ways. And we would have seen this as we read through, but we're just going to have it condensed at this point. Spy, 12 times. Spy out, 8 times. View, 2 times. Backbite, 1 time. And it only translates it as slander 1 time in the King James. Now, some of your other English will have it like we just read there in Psalm. But the idea is that this word that we say means slander in the scriptures is translated as spy or spying way more than it is slander. And the Hebrew word has the connotation of somebody walking around, going around, traveling around. And it's the idea of, if you think of what a spy does, a spy's job is to go somewhere, gather information, and then report back. And then you take that information and you do something with it. Like if we think about the spies, the 12 spies that went into the land, they were going there to gather information, and then they were bringing it back, and then Joshua was going to make decisions based on that, was the idea. But that's the root word for slander. And so if we think about it, why would spying out and why would slander have anything to do with each other? So we'll just go ahead and read the other scriptures that I have lined up here for slander. And this is slander, slandering, slandered, all the different forms there. Leviticus 19:16. You shall not go about as a slanderer, some translations say talebearer, among your people, and you are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am Yahweh. And we'll get back to that in a second. Ezekiel 22:9. Ezekiel 22:9. Slanderous men have been in you, Israel, for the purpose of shedding blood, and in you they have eaten at the mountain shrines. In your midst they have committed acts of lewdness. So slanderous men, and it says their purpose is shedding blood. Okay? And, that was Ezekiel 22:9. Proverbs 20:19. That's the next one we'll go to. And this is going to connect us over to gossip here in a minute. Proverbs 20:19. And remember, the whole idea is looking for this in ourselves, not the other guy or gal. Proverbs 20:19. He who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with a gossip. And so we'll get to that in a minute. There's a conception of a lot of people, myself included, we tend to kind of overlap slander and gossip as kind of the same ideas. And normally when we read the Proverbs, he does the whole doublet thing, where he'll say something one way, and then he'll say it another way. And he's talking about the exact same thing. He's just wording it differently to kind of reinforce the meaning. I think in this case, if we read it as a doublet, then we would put an equal sign between slander and gossip. But even though they are connected, I don't think there is an equal sign. And that's why I think it's important to kind of delineate between the two. So if we go back up to the idea that this word for slander has to do with going around, gathering information, spying, okay? We just read in Leviticus 19 that it was, let me just go back there real quick so I don't misquote it. Leviticus 19, you shall not go about as a slanderer among your people. You are not to act against the life of your neighbor. Okay? And then we read about, bloodshed. So this has the intent. When you spy, like militarily, the intent is to get intel on your enemy so that you can harm them. That's the point. If we go to, without getting too political, if we go back to the whole Russiagate thing, we all remember that. There was an effort of spying out and gathering information to discredit a certain political candidate. And it was done with that purpose. It wasn't done for, well, let's just see what's going on. And no, it was done from the get-go with the intent of harming Donald Trump. And so that's kind of the idea of slander. Slander is you have the intent of harming the person in some way. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's just a reputation. It could be anything, and you're trying to find things, you're trying to get information that you can tell people that will accomplish that harm, okay? And so if I would have had all the 21 scriptures that I had lined up that show the spying, and you can do it on your own time. You just look up the word for slander, it'll take you to that Strong's, and you can see all those scriptures. I apologize for not having them here like I did. But you see that impression. All of those times when they were spying out, it was specifically to cause harm to the other party. So if we reflect this back on ourselves, okay, again, if I say something that is offensive, or it could be anything, and I'm not in the room when you talk about it, okay, the question is, if we talk about this, are we doing it to cause harm? For most people, the answer is no. I don't think most people are talking about people with the intent of causing harm. You know what I mean? So, like, if we have a situation like that where, like, let's say, for example, Chris, let's say Ezra, you guys have a conversation. Well, James said this. What do you think about that? I don't know, man. It was pretty crazy. Okay, I'm not in the room. But is your intent to harm my reputation or anything like that? I know you guys, so I know the answer would be no. Okay? So if you're looking at yourself and you're asking yourself, can I have this conversation without being a slanderer? In a situation like that would be yes. Now, if you're talking about the person and you're talking about the nitty-gritty details of, well, did you hear what he did? You know, like he has a mistress off in Ohio or something, you know, da-da-da-da-da-da. Like, when you start talking about that kind of stuff, you could still have the intent to harm, but maybe you need to know if it's true, because that's the kind of thing that is relevant on some level. You know, we see that with our politicians. Like, if we go back to Ron Paul, when he ran in 2008, they did the same kind of thing on him that they did with Trump. They were trying to find any kind of dirt that they could on him. They were going around spying. And of course, Ron Paul basically lived a life above reproach. They didn't have any dirt that they could pull up on him. They actually put him in situations where they were trying to kind of trap him into saying things where they could get a soundbite. Kind of like they did with Joshua, like trying to trick him into saying things all the time. And then they could say, well, see, he said X, Y, Z, here's our proof. They were doing that to Ron Paul. But the intent was to ruin him. But let's say, hypothetically, that Ron Paul had actually said something wrong. Like, let's say there was a recording of him saying, I support communism. Well, are we allowed to talk about that without Ron Paul being there? That's kind of important, because if he does support communism, we need to know that. So if you have a conversation about that, you're trying to get to the bottom of the information, but it's not with the intent of harming him per se. Now, if Ron Paul is running for president of the United States and he supports communism for real, well, he's harming himself, because you don't support communism as an American president, at least on paper. You know what I mean? So, like, if the person is doing the actions that are wrong, they shouldn't be doing the actions that are wrong. And somebody discussing that with the idea of just figuring out what's happening and addressing it is not the same as gathering that information and discussing it with the actual intent to harm him. Does that make sense? It is a little bit nuanced because if somebody's actually doing something that's wrong and you expose that, it is going to harm their reputation. But it stems from their own actions. It's not a false witness. It's not hearsay. And you're not like absolutely making things up. So I would say that most people are probably not guilty of slander. We really only get into slander when we get into like, political machinations and things like that. If you call somebody a liar, the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, you're just talking slander. Well, maybe you are a liar. Is that, if a person is a liar and you call them a liar, that's not slander. If it harms their reputation for you to call them a liar, maybe they shouldn't be a liar. You know what I mean? If you don't be a liar, nobody can bring that at you unless it's a lie. So that one's pretty cut and dry. The whole slander thing, it does have to do more with intent. Gossip is a little bit more interesting. Has anybody not seen Little House on the Prairie? You haven't seen Little House on the Prairie? We gotta have a party. All right. So Mrs. Olsen. If you've seen Little House on the Prairie, you all know Mrs. Olsen, right? When I think gossip, I think of Harriet Olsen. I just can't help myself. That was that was all through the show, all however many seasons, she was the gossip. And I would say that if we look at a case-by-case basis, there were times when she was also guilty of slander. Because sometimes she would actually make stuff up. She would try to gather information on, whoever it was, the Ingleses or whoever, and just kind of try to get people in trouble. She was just that kind of person. But most of what she does, I consider a gossip. So let's take a look at the word gossip. We're going to read some scriptures, and actually do have them here. It didn't delete. So let's go to Genesis 9. Genesis 9 and verse 27. And the scriptures that we're going to read here are going to have the Hebrew word for gossip. Genesis 9 and verse 27. Genesis 9:27. May Elohim enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servants. Now, you're not going to see the word gossip in any English translation in that scripture, but the Hebrew word for gossip is there. So let's take a look at Exodus 22:16. Exodus 22:16. Exodus 22:16. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. So again, we just read that. Nobody's translation has the word gossip in there, but if you look in the Hebrew, you will see the word that gets translated as gossip. So Deuteronomy 11:16. And what I'm doing here, I was going to do with slander, but for whatever reason, the scriptures, all 21 of them, vanished from my presentation. So Deuteronomy 11:16. Let's see if I get there. Deuteronomy 11:16. Beware that your hearts are not deceived, and that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them. Nobody had gossip in that scripture, I'm guessing. But it's the same word. Okay, we'll do a couple more. Judges 14:15. Judges 14:15. Then it came about on the fourth day that they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband so that he may tell us the riddle, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us to impoverish us? Is this not so? So this is talking about, Delilah trying to trick Samson into giving up the secret of his strength. Again, we don't see the word for gossip there. One more. Let's go to Job 5:2. Job 5:2. For anger slays the foolish man, and jealousy kills the simple. And again, nobody had gossip there. I see looks of confusion. That's exactly what I wanted. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Hebrew word for gossip. It's Strong's H6601. H6601 is the word patah. King James translates it 10 times as the word entice, which we read a couple times there. Deceive, we read that one. Persuade, flatter, allure, enlarge, we read that back in Genesis. May Yahweh enlarge the tents of Japheth. Silly one, and silly. So, even with that, there's no mention of gossip. Now, gossip showed up in my New American Standard, which is not the King James, but it all comes from the same Hebrew word. And so when we look at this word, it's got a bunch of meanings depending on its usage. It can mean to be spacious or open or wide. May Yahweh enlarge the tents of Jacob, so basically give him room, give him a large area. It can mean to be open-minded. Okay, so that same idea of being open, and that's what the word basically means, is to be open or to be enlarged. To entice, be deceived. It has to do in that context of being naive. So have you heard anybody say, oh, so-and-so so open-minded that their brain fell out? Say again. Like, I'm so open-minded my brain fell out. Like, if I say that, you're basically saying James just believes everything. Yeah, I first heard that from Shauna years and years ago. But being open-minded, generally speaking, is a good thing because you're able to take in information, and as long as you're using discernment, being open-minded is a great thing. But if you're not using discernment, being open-minded is a terrible thing because everything just gets to come in and there's no filter. And so when we look at like the virgin being deceived, or like Samson being deceived, and all these things, it has to do, when we take about this word of like they're naive. We just read the word simple here, like simple-minded, same kind of idea. So stuff is coming into the mind, and there's no process involved that like mediates the information. There's no discernment. So that's why we're able to use the same Hebrew word for open, entice, deceive. That's the same Hebrew word that gets used for gossip. And it can be a gossip or the actual act of gossip. And so if we look at the idea of why would gossip be connected back to this Hebrew word, I think it has to do, if we go back to Proverbs 20:19, and I mentioned how earlier, a lot of times when we read Proverbs, we read it in terms of doublets. And this one, a lot of times gets read as a doublet, but I'm kind of thinking, no, it's actually talking about two different things. So Proverbs 20:19, that's where it says, he who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets. That's the objective of a slanderer. The objective of a slanderer is to gather information that nobody else knows and reveal that, usually with the intent to cause some type of harm. Okay, that's a slanderer. But, therefore, do not associate with a gossip. And so, if I associate with a gossip, okay, there's a couple ways you could look at this. The gossip uses no discernment. The gossip is going to, things I do, things I say, things you do, things you say, they're not going to apply any filter to that. They're not going to use any discernment. They're not using critical thinking. They're just taking information in and repeating it. Okay? So if I'm around people like that, and they just repeat things with no discernment, we run the risk of the whole telephone game thing happening. You guys have done the telephone game. It's like if I start off and I say, Dave has a great hat. The next person says, Dave has a gray cat. And then, oh, Dave is very fat, which he's not, thankfully. But you see how this goes. This goes. And this is the problem. When you just repeat things without using discernment, nobody stops and thinks, wait a minute, Dave is fat? Let me turn my eyes and look at him. I can clearly see he's not. But a gossip would just say, okay, I heard this, let me repeat it. No discernment whatsoever. So you don't want to associate with those people because they will take things that you say, they will take things you do, and probably misrepresent that in some way because there's no filter. Now, if we get a slanderer involved, somebody's going around looking for reasons to, take you down. For maybe it's a grudge, maybe it's a business thing, it can be anything. They're going to go to those people. And if they encounter these gossips that are taking information and repeating it without any discernment, and that comes back to the slanderer, that's not a good situation to be in. So this is one reason why I think, like I said, it's two ways I think we could look at this. So we don't want to surround ourselves with gossips because the slanderer will encounter those gossips and it just gives them ammunition. If you surround yourself with people of good discernment, people who critically think, then you know that even if a slanderer does come into your sphere of influence to get information, they're not going to find anything unless it's your fault. If your actions and your words are actually worthy of being put out there as a negative, that's on you. You shouldn't say and do those things. But assuming that you're living righteously, you're living clean, and you've surrounded yourself with people who think critically and use discernment, when that slander comes to get information, it's like Ron Paul. They have nothing. They have to make things up. And that's okay. Let them make things up because it's not true. But if we look at the flip side, I'll just read it again. He who goes about as a slanderer reveals secrets, therefore do not associate with a gossip. So kind of the same idea. The slanderer, let's say he gets his information. And then he's telling people this information with the idea of harming you. Okay? So the gossips are going to hear the information from the slanderer. So the gossip can be the conduit of information to the slanderer, but the gossip can also be the conduit of information from the slanderer. And if the slanderer's objective is to shut someone down, and they communicate the information to a gossip, remember the gossip is not using discernment. The gossip is just taking things into their open head and repeating. So the slanderer is able to manipulate the gossips to get the word out that they are trying to harm you. And again, we saw this back in the whole Russiagate thing. They put the information out there, and the gossips, the people who had no discernment, didn't fact check, didn't even think logically, just repeated the information. And to this day, you can show people proof that the whole thing was organized, and you can show the receipts, and people still will not believe it because they still will not use discernment. And so I bring all this up to say, if you have a situation where you need to discuss somebody, okay, and they're not in the room, you're going to talk about them behind your back. It's okay. Like, we have to do that. There are situations where you have to do that. You can't, like, if you need to discern, like, I've got some friends, and they had a situation, I won't get too detailed, but they had a situation where a gentleman was treating one of my friends a certain way. And so he comes to me and another guy to basically work through that. Well, the gentleman in question wasn't involved in the conversation. So my friend is thinking like, am I committing gossip, or am I committing, slander, or lashon hara, as we say in Hebrew, evil tongue, by talking about him when he's not here? It's like, well, you're trying to work through this. So how else are we going to work through this if we don't talk about what's going on? You know what I mean? Like, you have to be able to have the communication. You have to be able to say the things. But the issue is, my friend wasn't coming to us with the intent of harming the other person. And he wasn't coming at us with information that he couldn't verify. He was coming to us with information that had multiple witnesses, so it was established. So there's no slander, there's no gossip. We're just talking about somebody because we have to, out of necessity. And so, working through that, when we apply it to our own lives, because, I'll say it till the day I die, you don't have community without communication. And so if we're going to have communication, we have to be able to speak what needs to be spoken. And I think that a good many times, people don't say what needs to be said because they're afraid of gossiping. They're afraid of lashon hara. They don't want to commit slander. And that's good, because if I'm surrounded by people who want to be those things, I would like to know who they are. You know what I mean? But I think most people don't want to do that. Most people are altruistic. And so but I think we hinder ourselves sometimes by not having conversations that could be had because we're afraid of crossing this boundary. And I think that if we look at it in terms of, okay, am I slandering? Am I gathering information with the intent of harming someone? For most of us, the answer is no. Okay, slander is probably a no-go for most of us. Gossip. Okay, am I gossiping by talking about this person with them not being here? Well, where did you get your information from? Did you fact check your information? I hate to say fact check because it has such a connotation to it, But like, did you do any legwork to verify the information that's coming to you, or did you just receive it with no questions asked? And then, if you repeat that to somebody, if they're a gossip too. And by gossip, I don't mean Harriet Olsen. She's just the visual I have. Not all the gossip looks like that. Most of it doesn't. But just taking in information and repeating it without doing anything to confirm it, that's where we get into gossip territory. And if you have a conversation with other people about somebody, and you've gone through the steps to make sure that you've got the right information, you've confirmed the facts, and now you're taking that information and having a discussion, in my opinion, that's not gossip. That's just talking, because if you seek counsel, how do I deal with this situation? Like again earlier, if I say something that offends somebody and 2 or 3 people need to talk about it, well, how do we handle what James said, or how do we handle what he did? That's okay. If the people have actually gotten the information before they have that conversation. If they have that conversation without getting the information and it's just assumptions, now we're in gossip territory. If we've got a group of people that have the information and they're talking about it, that's not gossip. And in a case like that, just using myself as an example, I would hope that anybody could come to me and just ask me those questions. Because if you don't confirm before you talk, then you do kind of run into gossip. You know what I mean? And it can be that for anybody. So that group of people, whoever it is, hypothetically, if they've got the information and they're just talking about it, well, how do we handle what James said? How do we handle what he did? That's A-okay, if they have the information. But if they don't have the information, well, then what's the point? But anyway, so I just kind of wanted to put that out there. It would have taken more time to get through this if I had my other 21 scriptures, which are, I guess they were raptured. Maybe we missed it. But anyway, so it's a really simple point. Slander is more to do with intent. You're intending to harm somebody. You're gathering information. And gossip is just receiving and passing along information without doing anything to verify it. And when you put those two together, it's really bad. They're bad enough on their own, but when you put them together, it's a recipe for disaster. But we've got to be able to navigate through this. So basically, just generally, if you find yourself in a situation where you need to talk about something that somebody said or they did, and you're concerned about, well, can we even have this discussion because maybe it's gossip, maybe it's slander, you can ask yourself these questions, like, what is the intent? Do we have the information? If the answer is good on both ways, you have positive intent and you make sure you've confirmed your information, then go ahead and have your conversation. There's no need to put the brakes on it and worry about being a gossip, and this is the whole thing. If I go to Matthew 18, the whole Matthew 18 process, if a person offends you, right, then you go to them in private and you talk about it. And then if you're able to reconcile and get it worked out, great. If they still don't receive what you're saying, then you bring 1 or 2 more witnesses. Well, just logically, if I bring those 1 or 2 witnesses into that conversation with no background, how is that going to work? Before I bring the 1 or 2 witnesses in with me, they have to know the situation. But if I'm talking about the situation without the person present who we're confronting, is that gossip? Is it lashon hara? I don't think so. Because the intent is to bring it to that person in a way that reconciles. You're not trying to harm that person's reputation. You're not trying to injure them in some way. You're trying to do something positive. So yes, you're having a conversation about that person without them being present, but your motives are good. And does that make sense? It really has to do with intent, and it has to do with discernment. So if your intent is good and you're actually using discernment, then I see no reason personally why we can't have these kinds of conversations and work through stuff. And if it ends up negatively impacting a person because what's being said and talked about is true, then that person shouldn't behave that way. It's like if I talk about the stereotypical, Baptist pastor or whatever that gets caught in adultery or whatever, like, oh, we can't ever talk about that? Like, why? Are we slandering the pastor because we're talking about what he did? Maybe he shouldn't have done what he did. Now, if we're talking about that without having any information, oh, did you hear Pastor so-and-so? If we're doing that whole thing, then yes, we are gossiping. There might be some slander there. But if the evidence is there, and yeah, it's kind of obvious, how do we handle this? How do we respond to our pastor, mega church pastor or whatever doing this? You have to be able to have those discussions. And if we don't have those discussions because we're afraid of being gossips, well then there's no accountability, nothing ever gets done. So hopefully that made sense to everybody. Everybody stayed awake, I think, so. That was relatively short, I know. But I kind of wanted to leave ample time for Q&A and questions and things like that, discussion. Because I know I can't be the only person that deals with this. I've had several situations over the years where I've seen somebody behave a certain way or do a certain thing or say a certain thing, and it's like, well, if I talk about it with this other brother over here, with the person not here, am I talking about this person behind their back? But you can't always include that person for logistical reasons. So do you put the brakes on it and say, well, we just can't address this at all? Or do you go ahead and just address it, mindful of the need to have all the information, or at least have a reasonable amount of information? So hopefully that made sense. Does anybody have any questions, comments, strong opinions?